Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. We, like the rest of Klal Yisrael, are up to Parshas Yitro, and I'd like to do a bunch of Rambans this morning, depending on the time. One, a narrative related to Ramban, which is the fundamental question of when did Yitro and the story of Yisro's return to Klal Yisrael, did it happen before Matan Torah or after? That leads into the fundamental question, and I think this is the first time it appears in the Ramban, of yesh mukdam meuchar b'Torah or ein mukdam meuchar b'Torah. And then we'll do a few Rambans in and related to Maimad Har Sinai, where I think the Ramban has a unique approach, which we'll all enjoy. So the parsha begins, Vayishma Yisro Kohen Midyan Chosein Moshe Eis Kol Asher Asa Elohim LeMoshe uLYisrael Amo Ki Hotzi Hashem Ki Hotzi Adonai Et Yisrael MiMitzrayim. Okay, Vayikach Yitro Chosein Moshe Tzipora Eshet Moshe Achar Shiluchel, and the two sons, and they return. And the fundamental question is going to be, and it's a major machlokes harishonim, when did Yisro return? Did he return before Matan Torah, which is the way the pasukim appear, or did he return after Matan Torah, which maybe yields us a better understanding of the story? So the Ramban, who has a position on this, first, he's very thoughtful about how this works. First, he gives the other side a lot of credence. Says the Ramban, Kvar nechleku raboteinu b'parsha hazot, yesh mehem omrim ki kodem matan Torah ba Yitro kiseder haparshiot. Right, the order of the parshas. It sounds like first he came, then Maimad Har Sinai. V'yesh mehem shamru she'achar matan Torah ba. V'zev vaday yistayeh min hakatuv shamar vayavo Yitro chotein Moshe ubanav v'ishto el Moshe El Hamidbar Ashahu Chonesh Sham Har Elohim. Says the Ramban, that sounds like they already camped there. They already had got the Aseres Adibros. Hine Amar Shabai La Bachanoto Lifnei Har Sinai Shechanu Sham Shana Achat. Right? We all know Klal Yisrael spent a year at Har Sinai. It sounds like he came while they were camped there. V'zeh tam Ashahu Chonesh Sham. V'od Sha'amar V'hodati Et Chukei Elohim V'Torotav. That what was the problem with Moshe judging Klal Yisrael? Well, he had to judge them based on the Torah. So obviously, says the Ramban, in those pasukim seem to point to the fact that Yisro came after Matan Torah. And then Va'od, Ki kan amar vayishlach Moshe et chotno vayelech lo al artzo, he left. V'hayazeh b'shana hashniya b'nasa mehar Sinai k'mo shemar b'parshat ba'alotcha vayom Moshe l'chava ben Ruel hamidyani chotein Moshe nosim anachnu V'sham katuv vayomer lov lo elech ki im el arti ve'el moladati elech v'ha halicha haktuva bekan vayelech lo el artzo. Right? In Parshas Bahaloscha in Bamidbar, Yisro leaves again. So Ramban says in this first presentation of Psukim, it sounds like no, that's the same story as here, and Yisro came and left after Matan Torah. Okay, that's the beginning. But then the Ramban points out the obvious. And this is going to be his shita, l'chol Torah kula. V'im kein nitztarech ta'am lama makdim har pasha azot liktuva kan. Right? Why would it be the case? Okay, the Torah can, and even the Ramban we recognize sometimes does change the order of events. But there needs to be a reason. Right? Anytime the Torah is going to change the chronology, there's got to be a reason why it does so. What would be the reason? And so says the Ramban, despite the fact he's not completely dismissing it, there is support for Yisro coming after Matan Torah. He says, but nevertheless, I don't think so. And he says, V'im kol ze ani shoel ala deya hazo, ki shamar hakatuv vayishma Yitro kol asher asa Hashem LeMoshe Yisrael amo, ki hotzi Hashem et Yisrael miMitzrayim. Famous question. V'lama lo amar Sheshama masha asa LeMoshe uLYisrael b'matan haTorah shu mehan niflaot hagidolot shena'asu lahem. Right? Why does the Torah tell us? He heard that God took us out of Mitzrayim. He heard that. He didn't hear about Matan Torah. Matan Torah is the greatest religion, the greatest, Gilui Shechina in the history of the world. If he came after Matan Torah, so why doesn't the Torah say, Yisro heard about X and Y and Kriyas Yamsuf and Matan Torah? That would be fantastic. But he doesn't say that. And so the Ramban says, in his classic thoughtful way, Vahakarov Elai Litfos Seder HaTorah. This is going to be the Ramban's fallback position for everything relating to the machlokas of yesh mukdam meuchar b'Torah or ein mukdam meuchar b'Torah. So the Ramban, in the absence of compelling proof that the order of the Torah was changed, and there are situations like that, and we'll see them in Bamidbar, but he says in the absence of that, yesh mukdam meuchar b'Torah, the Torah presents things in order. Sheba kodem matan Torah bihiyotam birifidim kimo shamar b'mechilta. No, so obviously Yitro came before matan Torah. Rabbi Yeshua omer milchemet Amalek shama uva she ktuva b'tzido. Right, he heard about the war with Amalek. V'nosai ma'am mirifidim el har Sinai v'hakatuv shamar el hamidbar asher hu chonesh sham har ha-Elohim inyano ki haya har Sinai b'derech midyan karov misham shari Moshe halach l'sham lirot son midyan. Says the Ramban, obviously Yitro came before Matan Torah. Otherwise the Torah would have told us. And how did he come so quickly? Because Har Sinai, Har Chorev, is right next to Midian. How do we know that? Because originally, when Moshe came to the Sneh, he was shepherding Yisro's flock. So, okay, how far did it go? Did it go a day away, 2 days away? He lived in Midian. So it must be that Har Sinai is right there. And therefore, it was easy for Yitro to come after he heard of Yetzias Mitzrayim, after he heard of the war of Amalek, after he heard of Kriyas Yamsuf. Okay, almost done with this idea. Says the Ramban, V'chein nirali ma she'amar kan vayish. One point in before we get to the end. It's not really a machlokas between is there an order to the Torah or is there no order to the Torah. Rashi, who thinks ein mukdam meuchar b'Torah, obviously he thinks that Noach came before Abraham. There is an order to the Torah, but Rashi thinks for thematic purposes the Torah can alter that, and that oftentimes the Torah does. The Ramban would agree, of course the Torah can change the order if it wants, and if it has something important to teach us, but it has to tell us. And so in Sefer Bamidbar, the Torah gives you dates. And so you realize that one thing happened before another, and there's a reason to learn it. But in the absence of that, the Ramban says, the Torah tells us things in order. Again, there's a carve-out for within a story, but more or less, that's what the Ramban thinks. Now let's skip a bunch and go, V'chein nireli ma shamar kan vayishlach Moshe chotno v'yelach lo al artzo. This is just fascinating. So when it says that Moshe sent Yitro and he returned, Shahaya zeb b'shana harishona, v'halach lo el artzo, v'chazar elav. The Ramban is now changing his mind. He's saying it's not the same story here as in Parshas Ba'alotcha. Yitro leaves here, but he returns while they're still at Har Sinai. V'yitachen shalach sham ligayer et mishpachto v'chazar leMoshe v'odenu b'Har Sinai ki karovu l'midyan k'Moshe yizkarti. Right? He went home to megayer his family, and he returned. It's not a long distance. Shari bin so hamachane bi'iyar b'shana shniya. When they started traveling to Eretz Yisrael before Chet HaMeraglim, in the second year, Kishamar below Moshe, Nosim anachnu lecha itanu ve'itavnu lach, ki Hashem diber tov al Yisrael, please come with us, v'no to lo elech, ki im el arti ve'el mol arti elech. Hitchanein lo Moshe ma'od, v'amar lo al na ta'azov otanu, v'yita lanu le'inayim, v'haya ki telech imanu v'haya tov hahu asher yitiv Hashem imanu ve'itavnu lach, V'lo heishivo to davar, right? The Torah does not record a response, and most people think, okay, Yisro left. Says the Ramban, v'niresh shekibel dvarav v'asa kirtzono v'lo azavam. The Ramban thinks no. I think Yisro accepted Moshe's arguments, and he stayed with Klal Yisrael. Okay, that's just a side point. But again, the first mention, the first representation, the first discussion of the machlokas that's going to continue l'kol Torah kula. And that is, how important is the chronology? The Ramban thinks it's very, very important. And if the Torah changes it, it would tell us. Okay, now, let's go on to the central story in this week's parsha. And that is Ma'amad Har Sinai. And perhaps we'll see, an interesting insight of the Ramban. So before you get to Ma'amad Har Sinai itself, there's the preparations for it. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Hine Anochi ba elecha ba'av ha'anan, בעבור ישמע העם בדברי עמך וגם בך יאמינו לעולם ויגד משה את דברי העם אל אדוני. It says the Ramban, בעבור ישמע העם בדברי עמך. What's going on here? So if you're following along inside, it's Perek Yutet, pasuk Tet. In the middle of that Ramban, says the Ramban, I come ba'av ha'anan. Amar Rabbi Avraham the Ibn Ezra says, Ki hayu bi Yisrael anashim shahayta lahem hanevua b'safek. There were Jews who didn't believe completely in prophecy. Va'af al pi shekatuv vayaminu b'Hashem Moshe avdo. It says they did believe in Moshe. Sham amar vayar Yisrael v'lo kol Yisrael. This is the Ibn Ezra. V'zeu shamar elav hayom hazeh ra'inu ki yidaber Elokim et ha'adam v'chai ki lo hayu ma'aminim kein mitchila. Okay, v'zeh tam ba'avur yishma ha'am b'dabri imach aseret hadvarim v'gam b'cha ya'aminu she'ata neviyai ki me'ata yit'amet etzlam inyan ha'nevuah. Says the Ibn Ezra, there were Jews who didn't believe in prophecy, and the psukim that imply that there were Jews who did believe in prophecy, it's true, of course there were, but not all of them. And says the Ramban definitively, ve'einenu nachon ki zera Avraham lo yistapku b'nevuah. Says the Ramban, it's not true. The Jewish people do not have doubts about prophecy. Ki ha'aminu b'mei avotam, they accepted it from their parents. Ukvar amar od vaya'amen ha'am vayishmu vayaminu b'Hashem Moshe avdo. Right, it says they believe. V'im lo amar ani ba'elecha ba'av hanan shet. V'im lo amar sham kol ha'am v'chol Yisrael. Avkan lo ne'amar babu yishma kol ha'am b'dabri imach. Right, if you're going to claim that they believed, but not all of them, here too it doesn't say all of them believed. Here comes the Ramban's point. V'hanachon be'enai she'amar ani ba'elecha ba'av ha'anan shetigash ata el ha'arafel ba'avur yishma am divarai v'yihiyu heim atzmam nevi'im b'divarai. Says the Ramban, there's a difference between belief and knowledge. And one of the really, really important things that happens at Maimad Har Sinai isn't Aseres HaDibros. Of course, the substance of Aseres HaDibros really matters, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us Aseres HaDibros at Har Sinai. But the Ramban sees all these other things going on around it that matter more or as much as Aseres HaDibros. At Aseres HaDibros, at Maimad Har Sinai, says the Ramban, we didn't believe in prophecy, we experienced it ourselves. And that changes everything, right? I could believe things, but it's still just a belief. But to know it as a fact, to experience it myself, changes everything for me. Now it's not just a belief, it's actual knowledge, right? We could talk for a long time about the difference between belief and knowledge, and belief in the existence of God or knowledge of the existence of God, right? Laha'amin or ladat, two girsas in the Rambam and two discussions. But here says the Ramban, no, they experienced it. They didn't believe it, they knew it. Lo sheya'aminu mipi acherim, they didn't need others to tell them that God speaks to human beings. God spoke to them. K'mo shneimar be'emor Hashem elai hakel yita'am v'ashmir t'vorei l'man yilmedun li'ra'oti kol hayamim v'gam b'cha ya'aminu lanetzach b'chol adorot. Says the Ramban, one of the purposes of Maimad Har Sinai was for Moshe Rabbeinu, not just for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'im yakum b'kirbam navio cholem chalom kineged dvarecha yakchishu miyad. If a false prophet shows up, Bnei Yisrael will reject him. Shekvar ra'u be'eineihem v'shamu ba'aznehem shehagaat lemala ha'elyonim b'nevuah. They know that you, Moshe Rabbeinu, reached the highest possible level of prophecy. Yitba'er lahem mimcha ma shekatuv im yenviacham Hashem b'amara elav et vada b'chalom adaber bo lo kein abdi Moshe b'chol beiti ne'eman hu pe el pe adaber bo b'mareh v'lo b'chidot utmunat Hashem yabit. They'll know all these things as a fact. Ulekach amar ba'avur yishma ha'am b'dabri imach ki yishma divarai mitoch ha'esh v'yedu she'ani Hashem medaber imcha v'ya'aminu b'dvarai v'gam b'cha le'olam. Right? Why is this so critical? Why is nevuah so critical? Because for whatever reason, and we'll see this in a few minutes in a slightly different form, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to give the whole Torah to Klal Yisrael. It's critical that they believe in Moshe, so that they believe that the Torah that Moshe gives them is the Torah that Moshe got from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. To do that, they themselves had to experience prophecy, so that they believe. Lomar, hinei nitkayem hadavar etzleinu b'ri'iyat einenu ka'asher haya chayfetz Elokim. We experienced it ourselves. Umeata krabata. Now that we know that it's true, now that we experienced it ourselves, and it's not just something we heard from somebody else, shi'adanu b'cha shi'igata l'ma'ala hagidula. V'shama kol asher amar Hashem Elokeinu v'shamanu mipicha v'asinu. Now that we know all of these things, shekvar ne'emana nevuatcha ki hi ha'elyona al kol ha'neviim. Now, why the Ramban keeps having to make the point that Moshe was the greatest Navi ever, and why the Rambam really emphasized this, right? One of the Rambam's Yud Gimel Ikra Emunah is prophecy. A separate one is that Moshe Rabbeinu's Ma'ala ben Nevuah, Shehu haya avla neviim lakodmim lefanav laba'im acharav. There'll never be a Navi like Moshe. Why this is so critical to the story, I'm not sure. But it's critical for the Ramban that one of the purposes of Maimad Har Sinai was establishing Moshe Rabbeinu as the greatest prophet ever. How was that done? Well, if you and I became Nevi'im at Har Sinai and we heard God's voice, we would know for a fact that God speaks to human beings. And then we would know we're at the bottom of the mountain. Moshe Rabbeinu is at the top of the mountain. So on some level, we would understand that what we're experiencing is just a fraction of what Moshe Rabbeinu is experiencing. And by extension then, when Moshe Rabbeinu comes to give me the rest of the Torah, we'll know that he's the authentic Navi HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Because we experienced it ourselves, he's experiencing on a higher level, and therefore what he tells us becomes the truth. Okay, that's a really, really important point before we get to the Aseret Sadibros. Now let's do one or two of the Aseret Sadibros if we have time. So there's a famous machlokes about which is the first of the dibrot. Right? The Torah says, "Vaydaber Elokim et kol hadvarim ha'ela lemor," and then comes Anochi Hashem E-lokecha asher hotzeiticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avadim. So the question is going to be, and it's a question we need to think about, where's the command here? The next one, okay, lo yechal lecha Elohim achrim al panai, that's a commandment. Don't do X, Y, and Z. But Anochi Hashem E-lokecha could be like an introduction. Just like Vaydaber Elokim et kol hadvarim ha'ela lemor, who am I? I'm God, who took you out of Egypt. And now let's start. The Ramban doesn't think so. Most Mefarshim don't think so. But the Ramban has a bigger point to make here. Says the Ramban, Anochi Hashem E-lokecha, Perek Chaf, pasuk bet, Hadibur hazeh mitzvat aseh. Says the Ramban, taking sides in a famous machlokas between the Rambam and the Bahag, this is a mitzvah aseh. Amar Anochi Hashem yoreh v'yitzaveh otam sheyedu v'ya'aminu. Right, the double lashon again, that they should know and they should believe. Ki yesh Hashem v'hu Elokim lahem. There is a God, and He is our God. Kolomar hoveh kadmon. He pre-existed the world. Me'ito haya hakol b'chefetz. Right? He brought the world into being. He created the world through His desire. V'yecholet, and His ability. He's omnipotent. V'hu Elokim lahem shechayavim la'avodoto. Right? The Ramban's making a significant point here. It's not a fact. The Torah's not just saying there is a God. Of course there's a God. But to accept God's kingship, says the Ramban, requires an understanding that being an Eved Hashem demands something of us. It's full of content. You can't just say, I believe in God. And how does it express itself? I don't know. I donate money to the Democratic Party. I believe in morality. I believe in a God who believes in exactly what I believe in. The Ramban says that's not how it works. It can't work. Now, going back to the machlok, well, we'll go ahead, then we'll come back. V'amar asher hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim ki hotzetam misham Torah la-mitziut v'ala-chefet. The fact that God took us out of Egypt, He's not just any God. He is the God who took us out of Egypt. That proves that He created the world, because every miracle that He did, right, to make a miracle, to change the course of nature, means you created nature. Ki biyidiyah uvahashkacha mimenu yatzanu misham. It's through God's hashkacha pratis on each and every one of us that He took us out of Egypt. V'gam Torah la-chidush ki im kadmut ha'olam lo yishtanu davar mitivo. Says the Ramban, in a perfect world, or in a proper world, God created nature, and nature runs the world. When God changes nature, it proves that He controls nature. It proves that He's God who created the world. V'torah la-yicholet v'ha-yicholet Torah la-yichud. Right? God being omnipotent means, to a rational mind, He's the only one. If He could do anything He wants, if He has the power to do anything He wants, it means it's His power and His alone. Kimo shamar bavur teda ki ein kamoni b'chol haaretz. V'zeh tam asher hotzeticha ki hem hayodim ve'edim b'chol eila. Right? He's talking to the Dor Yotzei Mitzrayim. So when He says Anochi Hashem E-lokecha asher hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim beit avadim, they understand what that means. They understand that it means three things. One, He created the world. Two, He has hashkacha pratis on the world. He desires to be involved in the world. And three, He's unique. He's omnipotent. There's no one like Him. There's nothing like Him. There can't be anything like Him. So says the Ramban, there's a mitzvah to believe in God, but that mitzvah has content. And the content is these points he keeps making. That God created the world, that God controls the world, that God has hashkacha pratis. To just believe in some force that's external to the world, that's not the mitzvah of Anochi Hashem E-lokecha. To believe in a God who took us out of Mitzrayim, and that's a significant point. To believe that the God did that, and that God can do anything and everything that He desires to do, that's the mitzvah of Anochi Hashem E-lokecha asher hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim beit avadim. Now, just continuing in the Ramban, mi beit avadim, shayu omdim b'Mitzrayim b'beit avadim shvuya leParo. We were captives of Paro. V'amar lahem zeh shehem chayavim sheyeh Hashem hagadol hanichbad v'hanora hazeh lahem le'elokim sheya'avduhu ki hu pada otam me'avdut Mitzrayim. Right? On some level, says the Ramban, we owe God. God miraculously took us out of the house of Mitzrayim and the house of Paro, and we owe Him for that. Kitam avodai asher hotzeiti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. God took us out. Ukvar ramazti od lemala tam sheni. Okay, different names, don't need that. Last line. V'zo ha-mitzvah tikra b'divrei rabotenu kabbalat malchut shamayim. Right? We associate kabbalat malchut shamayim with Shema. But originally, kabbalat malchut shamayim, says the Ramban, comes from this situation of Anochi Hashem E-lokecha asher hotzeticha me'eretz Mitzrayim beit avadim. Now, I started saying this before, but thought better of it. The Rambam also has a mitzvah of belief in God. Okay, maybe there's a slight difference between the Ramban's content and the Rambam's content, but it more or less is the same. The Bahag does not have a mitzvah of Anochi Hashem E-lokecha. And a lot of people mistake the Ramban defends the Bahag in his Hasagot to the Sefer Mitzvah of the Rambam in Hasaga Aleph, but that doesn't change the fact that the Ramban thinks the Rambam is right. Right? The Ramban there has a very, very compelling position. He says, and he quotes the Medrash here, but for a different purpose, he says, a king becomes the king. So he shows up to a village, so people say, Gizor aleinu gezerot, tell us what to do. So he says, no, first accept malchuti, then I'll be gozer gezerot. First you have to accept my kingship. So the Ramban suggests there that for the Bahag, it's not that Anochi Hashem E-lokecha is not a mitzvah because it's not important enough. It's too important. It's the foundation of all of Taryag mitzvos. Once we accept God as our king, now God gives us Taryag mitzvos. That's what the Ramban says in defending the Bahag. But here he makes clear, okay, that's a defense of the Bahag. The Rambam was mean to the Bahag, and the Ramban felt the need to defend him. But lemaisa, the fact is, says the Ramban, there is a mitzvah to believe in God, and that mitzvah has content, right? I would suggest, I think I may have heard this from Rav Rosenzweig once, that the Rambam and the Ramban here refuse to make a distinction between mitzvos and the mitzaveh, right? And the Ramban makes this point here. If there is a God, he makes demands on us. To believe in a God who doesn't make any demand on you, who doesn't require anything of you, is not to believe in God. It's some theoretical point. But we believe in a God who demands things of us. That's the kind of God we want to believe in. That's the kind of God we have to believe in. In return for taking us out of Mitzrayim, there's a certain obligation that we owe him. We want to be Abdei Hashem. We don't just believe in some detached God who has certain qualities that we associate with ourselves. No, we believe in a God who's a mitzvah and who we respond to. Okay, we're going to run out of time, so let's keep going. Go to pasuk Zayin in Perek Chaf. The pasuk isn't really so important for the point that the Ramban is going to make, and that is the following: we grew up knowing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us Aseres HaDibros, but we chickened out after two. Right? The first two, the grammar makes clear, Anochi Hashem E-lokecha, lo Hashem E-lokecha, lo yelecha Elohim achrim al panai. Right? They are second person, HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaking to us. But after that, you come to mitzvos that discuss HaKadosh Baruch Hu in third person. Lo tishtachave Elohem, lo tavdem, lo tisad shem Hashem E-lokecha lashav, etc., etc. The grammar clearly changes, from which we understand that God gave us the first two, and then we got the last 8 through Moshe Rabbeinu, right? That's also supported by the Gemara at the end of Makos, that Torah tzivulanu Moshe, we got Torah b'gematria 611, because the first 2 we didn't get through Moshe, we got directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay. Got to go backwards. So the Ramban here says something interesting. V'hinei, lashon hakatuv hazeh shem Hashem E-lokecha lashav ki'ilu Moshe yidaber v'chein b'chal hadibrot achrei kein. The Ramban's agreeing with the grammar. You can't argue with it. U'vishnayim psukim harishonim Hashem yidaber anochi asher hotzeiticha al panai ki anochi le'ohavai u'shomrei mitzvotai. It's all Hashem speaking directly. Right? Shehem ikar hakol. The first 2 mitzvahs, I am your God, don't have other gods. That's the key. Rabbi Avraham Hiksheh. The Ibn Ezra has a problem with this. Ki hakatuv ama vayidaber Elokim et kol hadvarim ha'ela umefurash mizet hadvarim ha'ela diber Hashem el kol kalchem v'sham katuv od vayichteveim al shnei luchot avonim ki kasher amaram el kol kalchem kein kitavam al haluchot. When God says, I wrote down all the 10 dibros, he also says, I spoke all 10 dibros. So what's the Gemara talking about? Then he only gave us 2. Says the Ramban, V'ani afaresh lecha kabbalat rabotenu. I'll tell you what it means. Bivadai shekol aseret hadibrot shamu kol Yisrael mipi Elokim kipshuto shel katuv. Ramban says, no, obviously we heard all 10 dibros. We have to. The psukim say so. Has to be the case. Aval bishnei hadibrot harishonot hayu shomin hadibur umevinin. There's a qualitative difference between the dibros. The first 2, Bnei Yisrael heard clearly and understood. Kasher yavinotam Moshe, exactly as Moshe understood them. Va'al kein yidaber imahem kasher yidaber ha'adon alabdo k'moshe iskarti. It's like God spoke to them directly. It's like you and I became Nevi'im. Umikan ve'elach bishar hadibrot yishma'u kol hadibur v'lo yavinu oto. With respect to the last 8, we heard it, but for some reason we couldn't understand it. We were too overwhelmed. It's hard to know what the Ramban means by this, but we didn't understand it. V'yitztarech Moshe letagem lahem kol dibur v'dibur ad she'avinu oto mi Moshe. Moshe needed to tell me what lo tinaf was. I heard something, but I didn't know what it meant. Moshe Rabbeinu needs to tell me what Shabbos is. I heard something, but I wasn't sure what it meant. וכך הם מפרשים משה ידבר, והאלוהים יעננו בקול. ועל כן היו בהם דברי השם עם משה שאומר להם כן, והכוונה הייתה בזה כדי שיהיו כולם נביאים באמונת השם, ובאיסור עבודת גילולים כאשר פירשתי, לפי שהם העיקר לכל התורה והמצוות. So the fact is, says the Ramban, two different things happened at Har Sinai, but it's going to lead into a third. We heard the Ikrei Amunah, the belief in God, directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We were Nevi'im, and we had no doubt about it. With respect to the last 8, we heard them, but we didn't understand them. Right? Different pshatim of what that means, but we didn't understand them. But Moshe Rabbeinu told us what they were, and we believed Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? Because the first 2, we saw that God could speak to us, and we saw that we could understand. So with respect to the last 8, it made complete sense. We watched Moshe Rabbeinu. We heard God say it. It's like a transition. We heard God say it. We didn't know exactly what it meant, but we trusted Moshe Rabbeinu because of our own experience that what he was telling us was true. Why is this necessary? Because with respect to the next 603 mitzvos, we didn't hear them at all. So what the Ramban, I think, is implying is that this is preparation for the rest, right? V'ayidara Hashem Moshe le'mor, right? The rest of the Torah is all given through Moshe. It's Torah Moshe. But we trusted Moshe Rabbeinu because we watched, we ourselves were Nevi'im with respect to the first 2. With respect to the last 8, we were Nevi'im, but not really because we couldn't understand it. So we knew that the rest of the Torah was going to be given to from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu, right? If the 8 that we heard we couldn't understand, what would be the point of hearing the rest of the Torah? So it didn't bother us. Once we didn't believe, once we knew that Moshe Rabbeinu was the Nevi Hashem and that God speaks to human beings, it was no stretch to believe that with respect to all of Sefer Vayikra and Sefer Bamidbar and Sefer Devarim, that it's what Moshe Rabbeinu heard from HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. Har Sinai was a transition from not knowing anything and not experiencing anything to our understanding that there's such a thing as prophecy, and as a result, our belief in Moshe Rabbeinu as a Nevi Hashem. Okay, we did a bunch of things today. We did the major machlokas of yesh mukdam meuchar b'Torah or ein mukdam meuchar b'Torah. We saw a significant part of Maimon Har Sinai was our belief in Moshe Rabbeinu via our own experience, and we saw the first dibur, Anochi Hashem E-lokecha, as being a real commandment from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which has within content and requires things in return from us. Yashkach to everybody. Have a great, great Shabbos, and see you next week.